Could the tiny state of Bhutan be at the heart of a radical change in international relations? High in the Himalayas, a little-known border dispute has quietly influenced South Asian geopolitics for decades. While it rarely makes the headlines, the disputed boundary between Bhutan and China has been a significant regional flashpoint for many years, even going as far as to disrupt ties between New Delhi and Beijing. But could things be about to change? Or will this tiny country and its border dispute with its massive neighbour eventually stand in the way of wider efforts to improve India-China ties? Hello and welcome, I'm James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict and security. By their very nature, relations between large and small neighbours are often inherently unequal. The larger will typically have greater economic, political, diplomatic and even military influence, often forcing the smaller to bend to its will. This inequality becomes even more significant when a dispute arises and the small state finds itself under pressure to yield to its larger neighbour. But sometimes a country will find itself bordering not just one major power, but two. When these are strategic rivals, this can provide a vital counterbalance. But what then happens when that rivalry changes? This is the question Bhutan currently faces. One of Asia's smallest nations, its position between India and China puts it directly on the fault line of a long-standing and intense geopolitical rivalry. But while it's long faced territorial claims from China, its close partnership with India has helped offset its vulnerability. Until now. The Kingdom of Bhutan is located in the Himalayas. Landlocked, it's bordered by India to its south, east and west. Meanwhile, to its north, it has a 500-kilometre or 300-mile border with the People's Republic of China via the Chinese-controlled province of Tibet. The population is approximately 800,000, making it one of the least populous states in Asia. While most inhabitants are Buddhist, roughly 20% are Hindu. Mainly mountainous, with many peaks rising above 5,000 metres, the country is also marked by deep valleys where most of the population live. But while this geography has traditionally protected Bhutan, it's also pursued a strict policy of geopolitical isolation and non-alignment. Although it has diplomatic relations with nearly 60 countries, it's avoided formal ties with any of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Although Bhutan has a long history, our story begins in the 17th century when rival valleys began to unite. While this was later challenged by increasing British colonial control over neighbouring India in the 19th century and even led to a brief war, the country remained independent and became a kingdom in 1907. However, by the late 1940s, the situation was changing. As Communist China expanded its influence over neighbouring Tibet, Bhutan formed a close partnership with newly independent India, signing a 1949 treaty that gave New Delhi control over its defence and foreign affairs. This became increasingly important during the 1950s as the Chinese military presence in Tibet grew and Chinese maps showed Bhutanese territory as part of China. Meanwhile, just as Bhutan began to see India as a vital barrier against Beijing, New Delhi, which had its own territorial disputes with China, viewed Bhutan as a crucial buffer state along its northern border. Although China effectively recognised Bhutan's independence in 1971 when it voted to admit the country to the United Nations, it continued to maintain several territorial claims over its southern neighbour. These are now focused on 3 distinct areas. To the west is the Doklam Plateau, a strategically vital region near to the China-India border. To the north are the remote valley regions of Jakalung and Pasamlung. Then, in 2020, China suddenly claimed the Sakteng Wildlife Sanctuary, an area in the east that had previously been undisputed. Although each of these disputes has its own history, the Doklam Plateau is by far the most important. For China, controlling the area is seen as a way to safeguard the Chumbi Valley, part of Tibet extending into the Bhutan-India border. Meanwhile, for India, Chinese control over Doklam is viewed as a threat to the strategically essential Siliguri Corridor, a narrow strip of land linking India to its northeastern states. These sensitivities over the Doklam Plateau came to global attention in 2017 when China, which had been gradually encroaching on the territory, attempted to build a road on the plateau. This in turn triggered a 2-month standoff between Chinese and Indian forces that was eventually resolved when they both agreed to withdraw their troops. I hope you're finding this helpful. If so, please do give it a like and perhaps consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. It all really helps. Many thanks, and now back to the video. These tensions have put Bhutan in a difficult position. While India provides vital economic and military support, it's never been entirely able to avoid China completely. As a result, in 1984, a process was launched to try to resolve the border issues. But despite dozens of rounds of talks, little progress has been made. This is mainly because China's proposals have centred on giving up its claim to the essentially worthless northern valleys in exchange for land around Doklam. Quite apart from the domestic opposition to this in Bhutan, any such agreement would inevitably lead to tensions with neighbouring India, which would see it as a direct threat to its own security. But rather than antagonise Beijing by walking away from the talks entirely, Bhutan has instead tried to avoid reaching an agreement. However, this has come at a cost. As well as China's gradual encroachment into Doklam, where it's now built several villages, Beijing has also escalated its claims, as seen with the unexpected Sakten claim in 2020, a move many regard as a bargaining chip to gain control over the main prize, Doklam. But despite these past difficulties, are things finally changing? There are several reasons to suspect that maybe they are. Having taken control of its own foreign policy in 2008 and notwithstanding Chinese encroachments, Bhutan has in fact engaged more actively with Beijing. For a start, in 2021, the two countries agreed to the so-called three-step roadmap. Although the details are secret, reports suggest that this outlines a process that moves the talks beyond maps and will lead to the start of ground surveys, eventually resulting in a final border demarcation. If true, this suggests that both countries want to make progress where they can. For Bhutan, this would ease the sense of vulnerability it feels because of an unresolved border with a rising superpower. Meanwhile, for China, it would provide a useful diplomatic achievement at a time when Beijing is keen to demonstrate peaceful boundary resolution. Tied to this, as Bhutan modernises, its foreign policy is changing. Aside from the fact that China's growing strength in international relations simply can't be ignored, as it becomes more open to the outside world, Bhutan is increasingly aware that such a deep, long-lasting dependence on any single partner, even India, may limit its options. Resolving the border dispute would ease tensions with a crucial neighbour and give Bhutan greater freedom to chart its own course without the perpetual risk of being caught in a crisis. But perhaps the most interesting and potentially significant factor now at play is the seemingly changing relationship between India and China. After decades of tensions, a thaw appears to be emerging between Beijing and New Delhi. This was vividly highlighted by the apparent warmth shown by Prime Minister Modi and President Xi when they met at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in August 2025. Although tensions persist, both nations have recently shown a desire to stabilise their relationship, recognising that prolonged hostility benefits neither of them. In this context, a more stable India-China relationship could create the diplomatic space for Bhutan to seek its own resolution without fear of offending India or destabilising the region. But in any case, Doklam will remain central to this issue. Assuming Bhutan still aims to avoid provoking India, any agreement involving territorial changes in the plateau would indicate a significant shift in the relationship between India and China, suggesting that New Delhi no longer perceives Beijing as the threat it once was. Similarly, an agreement that excludes Doklam could also be seen as China withdrawing its need to dominate the region in response to a perceived Indian threat. But equally, failing to resolve the border dispute could also signal that despite their apparent warmth, the relations between Beijing and New Delhi remain firmly constrained by traditional security concerns. Even if China and India desire better ties, the strategic implications of Doklam may be just too much to allow for a deal. Of course, one could also argue that a failure to reach an agreement may also reflect Bhutan's opposition to a deal, especially as China has already annexed parts of its territory. This is true. However, Bhutan may be willing to accept limited losses as the price for gaining a fully defined border with a rising power, especially if India agrees. Ultimately, aside from strengthening Bhutan's sovereignty by removing the uncertainty over its northern frontier, a border agreement between China and Bhutan may well be a critical litmus test for relations between New Delhi and Beijing. Given the issue's history, any breakthrough will inevitably signal that India and China, two pillars of the BRICS movement seeking to challenge Western leadership, are, for the first time, putting aside their long-standing mistrust and moving forward. In this sense, what happens with Bhutan's border, as seemingly insignificant as it may seem on the surface, may well be a truly critical sign of a changing geopolitical order. I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.